So next up we have Xun Huan talking about, from Sandia National Labs, talking about simulation-based Bayesian experimental design for computationally intensive models.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Woods, for the introduction and for the invitation here. It's a pleasure to be here at the Isaac Newton Institute. So my name is Xun Huan. I am currently a postdoc at Sandia National Labs in Livermore, California site. And this is joint work with Professor Yusuf Marzouk at MIT, who was my PhD advisor. So I'll be talking about simulation-based Bayesian experimental design, particularly involving more computational intensive physics-based models that I have encountered in engineering, perhaps a more engineering source. So let me just start with some broad introduction. So a lot of the experimental design work that I am encountering is motivated by engineering science applications that have uncertainty in particular, here are some examples. For example, we could have in weather forecast, there could be a lot of uncertainty in the parameters of the models, the boundary conditions, and even the model itself is often imperfect. And when these sources of uncertainty, they can aggregate and propagate, leading to perhaps unreliable predictions and subsequently suboptimal or ineffective decisions and designs. On the top right here, here's a picture of a combustion experiment that's being conducted in laboratories where we try to take measurements of in a shock tube where we put in some fuel, some oxidizer, and let it can ignite and measure the time, how long it takes to ignite, to learn about chemical kinetic properties, these parameters that we don't know but we like to understand in order to design better fuels, better engines. Here is a current project I'm involved in where we're looking at the design of an scramjet engine, which is for hypersonic flight. In this case, we may not only be interested in just optimizing some performance metrics like thrust and efficiency, but there's also a lot of uncertainty we want to understand, and perhaps we want to also minimize the probability of undesirable phenomena like structural failure or the flame being extinguished. So, as Dennis Lindley puts it nicely, uncertainty is everywhere and we cannot escape from it. So uncertainty quantification, part of the theme of this program, the way I see it is that it seeks to systematically bring together data and models, and using probability and statistics that allows us to characterize, to incorporate, propagate, and reduce uncertainty, especially in big engineering applications. Here is a kind of broad overview of where some of the uncertainty quantification research or subtopics, if you will, might come in. We may have some theory and some mathematical model available to us, and using this model, we can then make predictions while taking account of all those uncertainty sources, and that's often known as uncertainty propagation. These predictions can then be used to perform optimization under uncertainty to get good products, designs, and decisions. They can also be leveraged to perform experimental design, find good experiments that will lead to additional data that are useful to us to update our model or our theoretical understanding through data analysis, data assimilation. So this branch is perhaps often known as data-driven modeling or data-assisted model improvement, if you will. And experimental design often occurs on the other side of this learning iteration, perhaps can be thought as model-driven data gathering in some sense. And that's what I'm going to focus on today on experimental design. So I'm going to start with some description about designing batch experiments, and what I mean by that just means non-sequential design. And then I want to also take this opportunity to discuss some of my recent work in sequential design. Okay, so experiments, we're interested in finding good experiments because experiments are often expensive, time-consuming, delicate to perform, and perhaps it can also be politically sensitive, ethically sensitive. And not all experiments are equal. Some can give us data that are more useful, more informative for a particular purpose. And it's important then for us to find these good and effective experiments and carry them out. So experimental design helps address questions like, under what conditions should we carry out an experiment? What quantities should we probe? Where and when should we take these measurements? How many experiments do we need? When can we say that we have gathered enough information and that we can stop? So these are all very important questions that we want to address. And here is a kind of summary of the landscape of experimental design. Traditional designs of experiments sometimes don't necessarily need to have a model to carry out. What I'm more focused on in this talk is model-based optimal experimental design, where we seek to optimize a criterion that's based on a currently available model, perhaps that describes the physical phenomena we're interested in. And this optimal experimental design has seen a lot of development in the past decades. And when the model is linear, there's a lot of these optimality criterion that's based on the Fisher's information matrix or the design matrix. But when the model is nonlinear, which is often the case that we encounter in a lot of the engineering physics scenario, the computation is generally intractable to do. And if we want to use a rigorous information theoretic objective function and under a design theoretic framework, this is even more challenging to do. So the scope of this talk, the techniques I want to describe are particularly targeting nonlinear and expensive physical models, so physics-based models, with continuous parameter design data spaces. And we're going to take a Bayesian perspective and try to optimize information gain that can accommodate also non-Gaussian distributions. So here are some of the key steps of this design process. First, if we want to find good experiments, we need to define a criterion. What do we want from those experiments? And that's often may not be as easy as we think. But here are some possibilities. If we are interested in learning about a model parameter, then a sensible thing to do could be minimizing those parameters' uncertainty in some appropriate sense. If we are ultimately more focused on making accurate predictions from that calibrated model, then perhaps minimizing those output quantities of interests, bias, and variance may be a better thing to do. And overall, the objective can be customized by designating a particular loss function, so it can be flexible to do to accommodate the ultimate mission objective. In this talk, though, let's assume we're interested in learning about model parameters, and we're going after to minimize the parameter uncertainty from those experiments that we want to do. So the second step here is mathematically to quantify the uncertainty, how to characterize the uncertainty. So here we're going to take a Bayesian perspective. So here the theta denotes the parameters that we're trying to learn, try to infer, and y is the noisy data or the measurements we get from the experiment. So the Bayesian perspective would involve a prior distribution P of theta here, perhaps might look something like this. And we can then multiply by some likelihood function, normalize it through the evidence term to get to the posterior distribution, this P of theta given y. And it might look something like this, and generally under a nonlinear model, it could become funky looking. And roughly speaking, how wide or how narrow it is a sense of how much uncertainty we have reduced or how much information that we have gained. Certainly, all of this will be dependent on which experiment we choose to carry out. So all these quantities up here are all conditioned on the design variable, which I use D here.
It is also dependent on the choice of priors.
Absolutely. So yes. So the prior is would then be explicitly accounted for here. And yeah, that's a very good point. It is very dependent on that. Okay. So being a little bit more mathematical, and we can quantify the information gain more precisely using the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is a reflection of how much the distribution has changed from the prior to the posterior. And it's also equal to the mutual information between the data and the parameters that we have gained from performing that experiment. So this is the Kullback-Leibler divergence, and this is when we actually write it out. And this depends on the measurement data, on the measurement from the experiment y, so the data, and also the design variable. So we don't know what measurement we're actually going to get when we're designing the experiment because we haven't done it at this point. So a Bayesian thing to do will be taking the expectation over all possible realizations of the measurement conditioned on the experiment we plan to do this D here. Hands a little bit shaky. So after we take the expectation, we arrive at overall the expected Kullback-Leibler divergence or the expected information gain. So that I use the notation of uppercase U as a function of the design D. And evaluating this expected U or expected utility, let alone trying to optimize it over the design space is generally computationally intractable to do if we're dealing with nonlinear models and non-Gaussian distributions, and it has to be approximated numerically. One possible way to do that is to estimate these integrals using a Monte Carlo integration. And here we have samples, Monte Carlo samples of these theta, these parameters, and also the data measurements, these y's. We can draw them from, for example, from the prior distribution of theta and from the likelihood function of y respectively. So there is a possible way to do it. But this Monte Carlo estimator has this term in red here, which is the Bayesian evidence, the normalization factor in the Bayes theorem that has no closed form and usually is very difficult to compute. So one possible way to proceed from this point is to estimate it using yet another Monte Carlo term here. So then overall, we have a Monte Carlo inside of a Monte Carlo, and we have this double nested Monte Carlo estimator, which would be very expensive to do. But nonetheless, we have a numerical way to estimate our objective function, this expected utility. Now, I also want to mention there's a lot of work has been done to kind of improve on this estimator, for example, using importance sampling, using Laplace approximation. You can derive upper and perhaps upper and lower bounds of this estimator. That would be a lot more easier to numerically compute. Okay. So then, now that we have defined this expected utility and a possible way to approximate it, then finding the optimal design involves finding the D star that maximizes U. Now, if we do use that Monte Carlo approximation, then our objective function is effectively noisy due to the sampling. And so we need to find optimization algorithms and procedures that can accommodate these noisy functions. And for example, here is the noisy, the numerical U that we have seen in one of our investigations. You can see it's quite noisy. And I do want to point out that we're trying to maximize, not minimize, so it's certainly not a convex function, even if you smooth it out. So one approach we looked at among some others is the Robbins-Monroe stochastic approximation, which takes advantage of any gradient information that we may have to numerically find an optimal. So here's the optimization path in one of the simulations that we have taken. But using Robbins-Monroe's, we need to provide it with some gradient information of this objective function, which in general we may not have unless our model is fairly simple. And that also motivates us to try to create or extract gradient information by constructing some surrogate models that approximate the very expensive physical simulation. Okay, so this also is also motivated by just the double-nested Monte Carlo. It's very expensive to do, so it would be nice to use some computationally less expensive surrogate model that can also be accurate. And the particular choice that we have experimented here is to use polynomial chaos surrogate models. And very briefly, a polynomial chaos expansion is an expansion of a random variable. So here's the expansion, trying to steady my hand, where the basis terms or basis functions of this expansion, the psi sub beta, are orthonormal polynomials with respect to these C variables. And these C variables are reference random variables that usually have a simple and standard form like uniform or Gaussian distributions. If we once we have constructed this surrogate expansion, then we can sample that random variable and relatively easily, because then in the end we're dealing with polynomial functions only, which is not too bad to do. But we need to construct this polynomial chaos expansion first on that quantity, on that random quantity we're interested in from the model. The construction process involves computing the expansion coefficients, the C sub beta, so these expansion coefficients. And the one way to do that is to take advantage of the orthogonality property of the basis functions, so we can take inner products to project that function onto the basis functions, doing these integration. And these integration, it's usually, let's say, median dimensional. It could be high dimensional depending on how many uncertain parameters that you have. Now, depending on which quantity we're targeting, this may be smooth if it's a smoothly dependent physical response surface. When we do have some intuition that it might be smooth, we can make use of quadrature integration that can be more efficient in this process. And for example, we may not necessarily using a just basic tensor product quadrature in 2 dimensions in this case, but also sparse quadrature techniques and sparse quadrature that can also adaptively increase its resolution in different dimensions as it tries to detect how nonlinear it is in those different dimensions. All right, so here's a quick numerical example of the methodology that I have described. So here, going back to the shock tube experiment, the combustion example I briefly mentioned in the motivation of this talk. So here we're looking at the ignition of combining hydrogen and oxygen, where we have a chemical mechanism, which is a series of chemical reactions, and to accompany those reactions, we have these kinetic parameters, which govern how quickly a reaction would take place in one direction or the other. So here, in these experiments, one thing that is very useful to measure is called the ignition delay time. So it's essentially is when we apply the correct, let's say, temperature and pressure to this mixture of hydrogen and oxygen, after we have applied that condition, how long it takes for it to ignite. So that delay time is often of interest in these this physical science context. The design variable we have, can control the initial temperature of the system, and also how much fuel we put, how much hydrogen we put in the system. So that's the equivalence ratio. So the T and phi are the knobs that we have that we can control. So those are the design variables. And here on the bottom left, I have plotted that big expected utility function, big U, as a function of the design variable. So we have the design variable temperature and second design variable, the phi, in this space. And you can see that the highest expected utility occurs somewhere around here. Just for illustration, I have simulated the experiment at candidate designs point design A, design B, and design C. And if you do believe our expected utility, design B and C would be suboptimal. They have lower values, so around the bluish contours. compared to the optimal value design A here. And on the right side here, I have plotted the posterior from simulated experiments at those 3 different design conditions. And we can see that the posterior, so the posterior is 2-dimensional because we have 2 parameters that we're inferring. So the posterior at design A, it looks pretty tight. So we have reduced the uncertainty quite a bit. Whereas designs B and C, we can see that the posteriors are a lot wider, so to speak, qualitatively speaking. And this is a nice illustration that we can indeed achieve a much better information gain if we do follow an optimal experimental design procedure. Here's another quick example where we are looking at a diffusion field. So we have perhaps a plume of contaminant of chemicals that's just diffusing out into a region, into a square region in this case. So it's time-dependent process, and the goal is to infer the uncertain source location of that diffusion process. The measurements are concentration levels of that chemical at prescribed equally spaced sampling time. So we're not designing for sampling time right now. We're saying the times are fixed, but we're designing for the location of where to put the sensors in this case. So this is the expected utility function that I have also shown earlier, and the optimal designs are at the corners. It is symmetric because the diffusion process is isotropic, so that's why we do see the symmetry here. Here are the posteriors of the simulated experiment. So here I have I'm illustrating if the actual fictitious true source location, let's say if it were at this location, so that's the blue point here. And if we then put the sensor at the red X, so the bottom left in this first design, here's another design where we'll put the top left, here's a third design where we'll put it in the center. And then how the posterior would look like under those sensor placement. We can see all of these actually have almost like a, not quite circular, but fairly circular a roundish type of posterior. And again, this is reflecting the physics of this process, which is an isotropic diffusion. It's not quite completely circular because it's a square domain and I'm applying some boundary conditions at the domain here. And how much information we can gain from these measurements, roughly speaking, it can be intuitively can be reflected about with regards to, let's say, roughly the area that's being covered by these posteriors. So here's another example on the bottom row here where the true source location is at different point. So it's a lot closer to the bottom left now. And if this were the case, then we can see the posterior will be a lot smaller if we put it here, much bigger if we put it top left, and also fairly big if we put it in the center here. Now, what I want to illustrate from these pictures is that when I first look at this experimental design problem, because of the symmetry, we're looking at the square domain. If we only have the choice of putting one sensor, I would have guessed, let's put it in the middle, because in some way it's kind of equidistant or has the largest coverage of the square domain that we have. But in fact, that is the worst thing to do. As we have seen from this expected utility function in the center, it has a local minimum. And the reason is because that in this case, in the diffusion process, we do want to break the symmetry in some sense, so that overall in expectation, we have we would have the smallest area being covered from the posterior. So that's kind of like the intuition that I would have. And furthermore, if you kind of take a mental picture of these posteriors, on the next slide, I'm going to show the posteriors on some cases where we have two sensors, and we can see that how much of this posterior is further reduced than when we put that additional sensor. So here's I can go back and forth a little bit. And so on the first column here, I'm just repeating two measurements at the same point. So, or effectively putting both sensors at the same location on the bottom left. In the middle, I'm putting two sensors on the top left and the bottom left. So breaking the symmetry. And on the right, I'm just putting two sensors at the same location in the center there. So again, flicking back and forth between these two, we see that the biggest reduction of posterior area coverage, so to speak, is in the center column here. Oops. Is in the center column here. The left and the right columns, we do see some reduction in the posterior because we are getting additional information, even if we're just repeating the measurement at the same location, but it's not as much if in this case, compared to the middle column where we are really breaking the symmetry. So the key message I want to convey here is that there is also a lot of value in coordination between multiple experiments, and simply repeating a single optimal experiment multiple times, it may not necessarily be the best thing to do depending on the context of your problem. All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go to sequential designs, where I think there's a lot of interesting work and things to explore. So to motivate the value of sequential design, so here consider a scenario where, again, we have a chemical plume that's perhaps accidentally released somewhere in the atmosphere, and this plume is slowly diffusing out and also being carried around by the wind. We're interested in finding or inferring where the location, the source location of this contaminant is, and we don't know where it is ahead of time. We might have some prior knowledge, some educated guess over where it might be, and that's illustrated by these probability contours, so high, medium, and low, and that's a depiction of our prior distribution. We may have a UAV that we can fly around to take a sequence of measurements, concentration measurements, and use those data to help us infer where the source location is. Then the big design question is, where should we fly this UAV so that we get the sequence of most informative data measurements? Now, if we don't do sequential design, if we just do what I call a batch design here, then we have to make all the design decisions kind of a priori, only based on our prior knowledge before we take off, before the mission starts. And the mission profile might look something similar to this, where we simply fly to where a priori where we think is the most likely point of this source location, and then just take all the measurements in the experiments as this plume is being pushed around by the wind. In sequential design, we can get more out of this scenario. And in this case, in sequential design, we can make use of newly acquired measurements along the way to update our current understanding of the situation, and then make subsequent design decisions based on that updated knowledge. And then the mission profile might look something similar to this, where we fly to the first design point, take the first measurement, and use that to update our prior distribution to a posterior, so the contours have shrunk a little bit. And then based on this new situation, then we make the next design decision of where fly to. And then we can also repeat this process and update it iteratively. So overall, we would expect sequential design to give us more about inferring the source location, and so that we can complete the inference problem more effectively. So sequential design it is a harder problem compared to non-sequential design because we need to do that update. And currently, the majority of the approaches are based on greedy or myopic design, where we can repeat the next optimal design problem, apply the procedure for the upcoming experiment only, but without considering what might happen after that. So in that sense, it would have a myopic design horizon. And when we do that, it may not be the optimal thing to do. Mathematically, it is not optimal, but sometimes it can still be very good. The fully optimal description, mathematically though, needs to incorporate both the elements of feedback between the sequential experiments and also looking ahead to see what might happen afterwards beyond the next experiment only, if that thing is important. And that can be done through dynamic programming. As you can imagine, if we want to try to account of what might happen in the future, different scenarios, different trajectories, that's a very expensive thing to do. And I think that's why also dynamic programming has not seen as much action in experimental design overall. Some of the works I found using dynamic programming often rely on special problem and solution techniques, and in some sense you kind of have to in order to get some sensible solution out of it, because it's computationally very intensive to do. So the aim of the work I'm presenting here, we want to describe the mathematical framework and also some of the numerical tools to help find the optimal sequential experimental designs used under the dynamic programming description. And hopefully we can do that in a computationally feasible manner. So this is a little bit formal, but here we're describing all the core components of a general sequential design formulation. So we had the experiment index k that goes from 0 to n minus 1. So we're looking at a total of n experiments, and n is finite, and we're assuming we know that ahead of time, it's given to us. The situation will be a little bit different if we don't know how many experiments we're going to do ahead of time. The state variable xk, so that's the state after k experiments have been completed. It's a very comprehensive entity, a comprehensive variable, the state, that describes or contains all the information we need to make all subsequent design decisions in an optimal manner. It can often be broken down to two components. The belief state that describes the current state of uncertainty, so a natural Bayesian selection of the belief state will be the conditional probability, or the posteriors after you have done the kth experiment and the k+1 experiment, etc. The physical state would involve any deterministic but design relevant variables, like our current location of our UAV. Where we are right now would affect where we can go in the next experiment. So the design variable for the kth experiment, dk now, is actually the output of a function, mu sub k, that would tell us what is the best experiment to do depending on what our current state xk is. Because in sequential design, we have this feedback mechanism. It's no longer sufficient to simply ask what is the best experiment to do for the third experiment, period. But instead, we need to ask what is the best kind of design strategy to invoke for the third experiment. And what we actually do will be dependent on what we have experienced and observed in the first two experiments. So it's a naturally adaptive thing to do in sequential design. And then what we're really looking for are these functions, the set of functions, mu, one for each of the experiment we plan to do, and overall this set together is often known as a policy, or you can think as a strategy, or a control law if you're familiar with control theory. Noisy data from the kth experiment yk distributed according to some likelihood function. So often the model for the noise, the measurement noise, can be the computationally intensive physics model. For example, here that describes the diffusion process. It's a function of the parameters and also the design variables, and corrupted with some additive Gaussian noise. But it doesn't necessarily have to be in that form. The system dynamics, lastly, is this curly F here that describes how our state, xk, would evolve from one experiment to the next. And for the belief state, if the posterior, that's governed by Bayes' theorem. For the physical state part, it's whatever the relevant physical process is that will govern how it would evolve from one experiment to the next. So just to summarize what we have right now, we may have some current state xk, and we can then, we can then feed this state into our policy function, mu sub k, which would then tell us what is the best design to do right now, d sub k. we go ahead, carry out an experiment with the data from it, yk, and combine them into the system dynamics, then would evolve from xk to xk plus 1. And then we can repeat this process. So this picture is actually kind of a classic in control theory. So there's a very close connection between this sequential experimental design to stochastic optimal control. Next, in order to find the good design, experimental designs or policies, and maybe the optimal, we need to define some objectives. And that involves the stage reward G sub k. So that's the reward function, or it could be the cost function, or minus the cost function, for the kth experiment, directly related to that experiment only. Then we also have a terminal reward Gn, which is a kind of assessment of how well we have done after all n experiments have been completed. So if we're interested in parameter inference or information gain, that could be the total information that we have gained after all n experiments have been finished. So the sequential optimal experimental design problem, and I use the shorthand form SOED here, is to find the optimal policy, pi star, that maximizes the expected total reward. So that's just the sum of all the stage rewards plus the terminal reward, subject to the system dynamics and also any additional design constraints that you might have. So this is the optimization statement. But trying to solve this directly is very difficult to do because we're searching or we're optimizing in a function space. We're looking for functions that maximize this quantity, this functional. One possible approach to go from this point is, and often is done, is to re-express the same problem in a different form using Bellman's principle of optimality and formulate this dynamic program which involve these Bellman equations, these J functions, also known as value function or value to go functions in this case. So the value to go function for the kth experiment is the max of the expectation of the immediate reward of that kth experiment plus this same J function, but at the next stage, k plus 1. So this part is actually a summary of the total reward from our remaining future experiments. And you can think that the value to go function, so that's the to go part, is a balance between our present reward and also kind of best case scenario of our remaining future experiments or future rewards. Now, solving the dynamic program is also not easy to do, since the Bellman equations here are recursively defined. So k depends on k plus 1 depends on k plus 2, etc. So everything is kind of nested and fully coupled. But dynamic program is a well-established mathematical entity since probably Bellman, maybe even earlier. And it's heavily used, or the centerpiece in many major fields of scientific research, like in operations research, in control theory, stochastic control, and artificial intelligence, active learning. So there's a lot of existing literature and research out there under the label of approximate dynamic programming that has theorems and also has methodology that perhaps we can leverage, advance on them, and to help solve our problem, our sequential problem, design problem here as well. So that's what we're going to do. And the particular method we're going to use is approximate value iteration, or in other words, a combination of backward induction together with regression. So what I mean by that, it's probably easiest to explain through illustration, is that we will start at the very last stage, at the nth stage. And the reward function for the nth stage is the terminal reward. We know exactly what it is because we prescribe it. And then we can plug this terminal reward into the right-hand side of this Bellman equation. So Jn, we can put it here. And then we can numerically evaluate the right-hand side of this formula pointwise, perhaps through some Monte Carlo estimation of the expectation and with some numerical optimization for the max, pointwise at different x's. And those x's, we can treat them as regression points. and from those pointwise evaluations, perform a regression to construct a approximate function of j tilde n minus 1. So k plus 1 is n, then this is n minus 1. Once we have this approximate function, then we can plug into the right-hand side. So this then would become n minus 1 here, and repeat the same thing to get n minus 2. So in that sense, it's backward induction, and we can step all the way back to stage 1 or experiment 1. The regression problem, we can choose the regression points through a combination of exploration and exploitation. So what I mean by that, exploration is just kind of random sampling inside the design space. We want to explore different possible regions that may perhaps give us a lot of value. Exploitation is once we have some estimate of what a good policy might be, then we can simulate that, apply that policy to see which states we're going to visit, and put more regression points in those regions, in those state regions, because we want, intuitively, we want more accuracy in the state regions that we're actually going to visit eventually when we apply this optimal policy. So it's exploiting our current guess. And we can formulate an iterative procedure to go between exploration and exploitation and combine these two together to hopefully overall arrive at a numerical optimal or near optimal policy. So very quickly, this is the outline of the sequential OED procedure, set parameters, do initial exploration, compute some objects needed for repeated Bayesian inference. So that part I don't have a chance to describe here, but just to give you a little preview, it involves optimal transport maps. Then we can iterate in that algorithm I described to explore, to exploit, and then perform the approximate value iteration, the backward induction with the regression to update our approximate optimal policy. So here are some quick examples. Here we have the source inversion problem, that plume example I described earlier. Just very quickly, we have here we look at two experiments. Source location, the prior is centered at the origin. That's the key I want you to keep in mind. And our vehicle, our sensor starting location is to the right of the origin. So it's not a symmetric start. There's strong wind that blows from the left to the right, but only picks up after the first experiment. So it's a dynamically evolving environment. And we want to know where to measure to get the best information. So I'm going to skip this part and go to the results here. So here I'm comparing between if we follow a greedy design procedure versus the SOED procedure. So greedy design, we don't expect it to do very well because it doesn't look ahead. So it doesn't know that the wind's going to change in the future, and it cannot adjust or take advantage of that. So here I did 1,000 simulations following the greedy design procedure. So there's 1,000 dots. And here I'm plotting the actual design for the experiment 1 and for the experiment 2. So the design is simply the movement of the vehicle. Do we move to the left for negative values or to the right? And we can see that in all these simulations following a greedy design, we're all moving to the left initially with negative values, and then right in the second experiment in positive values. So we're chasing after the plume initially, and then after the wind is blowing to the right, we're chasing back after it. So that's not very efficient to do. In comparison, SOED, it anticipates this future wind change, so that even in the first experiment, it's moving a little bit to the right to set it up better so that it can intercept this plume in the second experiment, and so that overall it can get the most information from its measurements. So both of these are more positive compared to the greedy design. And indeed, the expected reward for SOED 0.15 is higher than the greedy of 0.07. And here is another comparison between a non-sequential batch design versus SOED here. And to really kind of emphasize or highlight the potential benefit of using SOED here, I'm changing the scenario a little bit where we can have access to a more precise instrument, but only under promising scenarios where we have already decreased our posterior variance below some threshold, 3 in this case. So it's reflective of like realistic engineering scenarios where we have an expensive instrument, but the agency might not let us use this unless we can demonstrate that we have already made some progress. It's promising. Then they can say, okay, now you can use this, better technology. So batch design, in this case, we're designing both experiments simultaneously, but with no feedback in between. So it sees the future wind condition, so even slightly positive movement, even in the first experiment, but there's no way for it to qualify for the second, for the better instrument by construction. Whereas SOED in this case, it's actually moving a little bit left in the first experiment. So it's chasing after plume a little bit initially. And the reason is because it's trying to balance between the potential reward and the risk, that it deems the risk is acceptable to move a little bit towards the plume initially. So give up a little bit of the efficiency so that it has a better chance of qualifying for the more precise instrument in the second experiment. So in these 1,000 simulations, not all of them end up qualifying for it. I think it's about 50% end up getting to use the precise instrument. But overall, in expectation, the expected reward 0.26 is much higher than the 0.15 here. And just very quickly, we also have some demonstration in a higher dimensional, 2-dimensional space compared to the previous one. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip that and move on to the summary slide, where we have enabled tractable computation for optimal experimental design targeting nonlinear and computationally intensive, a lot of these physics-based models, and formulated the sequential optimal experimental design that can incorporate both the feedback and look-ahead elements, integrated and advanced some computational procedures like stochastic optimization, polynomial chaos, adaptive sparse quadrature, and as well as this new approximate dynamic programming kind of iterative update procedure in backward induction, and with some demonstration of the design results in the combustion experiment, and also in sensor placement, both in a non-sequential and sequential setting. With that, I'd like to acknowledge our funding agencies, DARPA and the Air Force, and we may or may not have time for questions.
Do you have time for a quick question or two for this one? Serge?
Yes, no, very interesting. So the looking ahead, a step. How do you manage that? So I didn't completely understand how you average over all the possible future directions of this plume in order to design the optimal strategy. Is that right?
Right. So in a sense, now. Intuitively, I think we can think like that. We're doing a lot of kind of simulation into the future, but everything is kind of wrapped around nicely in the dynamic program statement, which is here. And if we follow this formulation and then kind of solve or find the solution that corresponds to this formulation, then we have found a solution, which is a policy in this case, that accounts for these future trajectory. So, so theoretically, if we just follow this, then we do find a policy that accounts for the look ahead. Now, numerically, we do need to do some simulation. Yes. So I guess going back to answer your question, yes, we do simulations. Yes.
So when we're doing computer experiments, often when we're doing it sequentially, we're not want to just get the next best point, because I've got to optimize my computer, I need to put in 5 parallel runs.
Yes.
So can you generalize this to that batch sequential state where you don't want the next best point, you want the next best 5 points, and then the next best 5 points?
I love that question, because we encounter that all the time. We may have a big cluster, we can send multiple experiments. So I think what will happen in this case is that we can augment the design space, not for one experiment, but a 5-dimensional design, not 5-dimensional, sorry. The design space for each experiment would involve 5 actual experiments. So it's kind of like a block sequential procedure. I think what would be even more challenging is if that size is not known a priori, because we don't know how busy the cluster is. So we might need to adaptively change this dimension on the fly. And I don't know how to do that right now. That would be really interesting to see.
Because that might be like you're getting a better instrument. You might get more computing because you're doing the job.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Just a bit, I mean, to which, I wasn't quite sure, are you still using Shannon, are you still using information-based approach? I mean, maybe some, I've always wondered, I'm very fond of Maxi as well. I mean, but maybe people should maybe think of really some nice cheap information criteria, like the maximum of the posterior, or something, or even a generalized variance, or something that you can to do a much quicker evaluation of the utility function. Have you thought of using other utility functions?
So I have not experimented currently with other utility functions, but I think that's absolutely doable. So here are the results I have shown. I do use Shannon entropy, so information gain, where that would involve the terminal reward here is the callback-Leibler divergence between the final posterior to the initial prior. Now, I think we certainly don't have to do that. We could put like something like a variance. Perhaps that's easier to estimate than compared to KL. It would definitely help, but it would still be expensive because we still have that max of E that's nested together. And if we want to kind of fully unravel that, it will still take a lot of different, perhaps simulations and all that to do. So.
And do you take advantage of the additivity of Shannon information? That's a nice additivity for. There are maybe technical advantages of using Shannon based on theories of information and things like that.
Okay, I have not thought about that yet, but that would, if it can be helpful to make the things simpler, that would definitely something I want to use.
Okay, well, let's thank Sean again.
Thank you.